Welcome. This presentation is being interpreted in Spanish. Click on the world icon at the bottom right of your screen to access it. If you're on a phone, click on the three dots and choose your language.
Esta presentación está siendo interpretada en español simultáneamente. Haga clic en el icono del mundo y seleccione ahí el idioma de preferencia. Y si está en su teléfono, hay 3 puntitos en la parte de abajo del teléfono. Ahí también lo pueden hacer. Thank you very much, Ariana.
Gracias, Mariana. The presentation is scheduled for about an hour, which will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. You can submit your questions via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen in the middle at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A. My name is Ariana Rickard, and I'm the Public Policy and Funding Program Manager for Sonoma Land Trust. As I'm sure you know, Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit that protects land in Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976 and have protected over 56,000 acres in our county so far. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members and contributors, so thanks to all of you out there who are helping us protect beautiful Sonoma County for future generations. Tonight we'll be talking about birds and the annual Christmas bird count. Maybe many of you have done it in the past or are planning to do it again this year. Key volunteers and donors have dedicated countless hours toward the development of bird lists for new Sonoma Land Trust conservation properties. Additionally, our preserves have hosted Christmas bird counts since 1982. Our lands that have been used for the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird atlas include Glen Oaks Ranch, Estero American Preserve, Pitkin Marsh, and the Baylands. As we pursue our mission of conserving land in Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples. We honor their knowledge, care, and stewardship of this special place across the ages and acknowledge the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted on them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Nicole Michel. She is the Director of Quantitative Science with the National Audubon Society Science Team. She joined Audubon in 2015 and leads a team of scientists responsible for analyzing bird population trends from programs like the Christmas bird count and developing metrics to track bird response to Audubon's conservation actions. She holds a PhD in ecology from Tulane University, completed 2 postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Saskatchewan, and has studied birds for more than 25 years. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her 2 indoor cats. Now, Nicole and I did our first Christmas bird count together, maybe 6 years ago. I couldn't quite remember, Nicole, in the East Bay. We're also Broadway buddies, and we share a mutual love of Hamilton. Our next adventure is Antarctica, which we'll be visiting next month. So welcome, Nicole. I'm so delighted to introduce my friend. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Ariana. I am so excited for Antarctica next month. Okay, so let me just share my screen here, and we will get started. Okay, well, thank you again for the invite, and thank you all for joining me today. And I'm excited to be here to talk with you about what we have learned from what is now 122 years of Christmas bird counts and counting. This is our 123rd year coming up. Okay, so the program for tonight is to first talk about some of the bird conservation challenges that we're facing. Many of you are probably already familiar with. I'm going to talk briefly about the history of the Christmas bird count, which we often abbreviate CBC. Then I'm going to talk about how the CBC is run, what it tells us about our birds, and other ways the CBC data have been used to inform conservation. And finally, we're going to spend a little time talking about climate change and birds, and then we'll wrap up with some conclusions. So we are facing a conservation crisis when it comes to bird populations. A paper that came out a few years ago now showed that we have lost 2.9 billion, yes, with a B, birds since 1970, which is a loss of nearly 1/3 of the population of birds we had, not just 50 years ago. And the greatest losses have been amongst grassland birds, We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We've also seen very large losses in migratory birds of 2.5 billion birds since 1970. And there are many, reasons for this. There are many challenges that birds are facing. As we're becoming increasingly aware, global temperatures are continuing to rise. This map here just shows through 2012, but we've had even warmer years since then. And also we're seeing precipitation patterns changing. Areas that, like here in Portland, that are typically very rainy, becoming more dry, other areas becoming more rainy. In addition to climate change, another big factor that is impacting birds is habitat loss. This here is a map that was put together by some NASA scientists showing loss in forest cover all around the globe. So green is areas where we still have tree cover, and then all of these red areas are areas where we've lost tree cover, even just in the last few decades. Well, these are some of the challenges we're facing today. There are also challenges we have overcome, but that were quite significant for birds. In the late 1800s, the Great Fashion, if you were walking down the streets of San Francisco, you were a proper lady, you had a bird on your hat. Sometimes just feathers, perhaps a gorgeous, egret plume, like here on the right, but sometimes a whole bird on your head. And this was high fashion. But that meant, you had to get all of those feathers from somewhere. And so the results of this were really frightening. We saw massive takes of birds like herons and egrets that produced these beautiful plumes. Another very popular pastime in the late 1800s, early 1900s is Christmas. The men would spend the day going out and doing what's called a side hunt. There would be competitions where people would go out and see who could shoot and kill and collect the most birds. And this was very popular, but of course, again, was devastating for many bird populations. And this led to the creation of the Christmas bird count. So Frank Chapman, who was then the bird curator at the American Museum of Natural History, and later became an officer of National Audubon Society, where I work now, decided to offer an alternative. Instead of going out on Christmas Day and competing to see how many birds you can kill, he proposed that you go out and instead compete to see how many birds you can see and how many birds you can count. And so the very first Christmas bird count happened in the Christmas of 1900, Christmas into New Year's, 1901. And every year since then, yes, even in the pandemic years, you can see here, volunteer birders have gone out and counted birds during the holiday season. This year is actually a photo not too far from you. This is a bird count I did in California in, 5-6 years ago. So this combined effort, the Christmas bird count has evolved into one of the two most important avian databases of the Americas that is known to science. This information, collected by volunteers such as yourself, is incredibly valuable. Also, the CBC is just fun. It's social. You're going out with groups. It's educational. You learn a lot, but also you're contributing valuable information to science. I just wanted to touch on a few central figures in Christmas bird count history. One is, we've already talked about, Frank Chapman. So he launched the CBC in 1900, and he continued to manage it until he retired as editor of Bird Lore, the journal that I showed the cover of earlier. He retired in 1934. Chan Robbins, who unfortunately just just passed away a couple of years ago. He's very well known for founding the Breeding Bird Survey, but he also began compiling and participating on Christmas bird counts in 1934 and kept counting until 2016. And then we can't talk about the Christmas bird count without talking about Jeff LeBaron, my colleague here at Audubon on the science team. He has served as the Christmas bird count director since 1987 and is just an incredible fount of knowledge and history and wisdom that he frequently shares. You might have heard him on NPR and other sources. So how did it get started and how's it going? You can see here the tremendous growth of Christmas bird counts. This just goes till 2019, but you can see it's going from 25 counts in 1900, really ramping up in, it's kind of hard to read these numbers, but this is 1970. It's really ramping up in the 60s, 70s to over 2,600. And same with the number of participants, from 27 to over 81,000. So looking at the two endpoints, in 1900, you've had 27 volunteers, 25 count circles. They counted over 18,000 birds of 89 species, and these counts were in 2 countries. And then you look at this last year, 2022, and we had over 76,000 volunteers, or 2,600 count circles. We counted nearly 43 million birds of 2,500 species, and the counts were in 24 countries. And this is what that looks like. So all of these blue little circles with the bird shape, these are all the counts that occurred in 2022. And then the countries that are shaded in blue have all had at least one count. Yes, even Antarctica has had a Christmas bird count. Imagine they counted a lot of penguins, but counts have occurred in 34 countries altogether across the Western Hemisphere. So a few highlights from this last count. Last year had the second highest number of, actually I believe it's supposed to be circles. This circle counts. It had the 4th highest number of participants. And amazingly, even after 121 years, we added 3 new bird species in the US. You may have heard about the Steller sea eagle, who has very famously been making a tour around North America. Showed up in Denali in 2020, I think, and then was spotted in Texas, and was hanging out in Maine for a while, and just popped up again a couple of weeks ago in Nova Scotia, I believe. We also had a bat falcon seen in Texas, and a social flycatcher. Birds familiar to those of you who've done much birding down in Mexico. So the most species at a US count was on the Texas coast, Matagorda, Mad Island Marsh. But when you're looking globally, the most species was in Ecuador, the Mindo Tandayapa count that I believe had over 400 species. An interesting fact that we're still working on digging into trying to understand the drivers of is that even though more and more people are going out and counting at more and more circles, we're actually seeing declines in the total number of birds that are observed. So we had, over 42 million this year, but back in the 1970s, they would typically count 60 to 100 million, even though it was in fewer locations with fewer observers. So that's something we're still trying to figure out. So how is the Christmas bird count run? It is a 15 diameter circle, and in that circle, observers go out and they count all bird species and individuals that they see or hear. And we also record information on the weather, on how many people are out there counting, and then how much time they spent, and the distance they covered, both walking and driving. What else? We also have a feeder watch. So some observers who don't want to be out in the cold will, stay home and watch their bird feeders and report the birds they see on count day. And so the counts happen during one 24-hour period for each count, and it happens within a two-week window during, the holiday season, and it always is between December 14th to January 5th. And then all of these data that are collected by all of the volunteers at each of the circles is compiled by a person called a compiler. And then they pull all that data together and enter it in a database and then send it to us here at Audubon. And these are just a few of the circles in Sonoma County, including there's one that has a count coming up this weekend, the Santa Rosa CBC. So as I mentioned, a compiler will enter their data into a database. So this is all available online. You can go to our webpage. You can just Google Christmas bird counts and it will take you here. And this is what the entry page looks like. And compilers have accounts. They can log in and enter the data. And then behind the scenes, what happens is, we have the CBC volunteers that enter their data. It comes into our big, database. And we do our work, because we have so much data to work with, over 100 years, thousands of counts. We do our analyses on the cloud. We use Amazon Web Services. And Tim Bean, is our statistical genius who runs all these analyses on my team. And then I'm going to show you where we share the results two different ways. We have our results server that provides summaries. And then we also, Tim runs analyses that let us determine population trends over time. And those are publicly available as well. Okay, so where do you go to see the results? So first, I'm going to show you the kind of the old school version where you can see the summaries, which is some very useful data. So again, you go to our homepage for the Christmas bird count, and you click here, CBC results. And that takes you to this page, and we don't have any results yet for 2023 because, well, it's the 15th today, so the counts just started yesterday. But if you click on a previous year, here you can see counts from the 60th count, which means 1960, through the 116th, so 2016. And this is for American crow across all the U.S. states. And you can see the average number of birds per party hour. That means, if 5 people go out birding for an hour, that's 5 party hours. And we use that to correct because, of course, the more time you spend and the more people who are out there, the more birds you see generally. So an interesting one about this one, why we pulled American crow, is you can see the spike in about 2000, followed by a crash. And so that was the arrival of West Nile virus to the States, and really heavily impacted crows and other corvids. Okay, so you can get your basic summaries there on species or by count circle. Then if you want to see the population trends, go back to our homepage and you click down here on this link, where have all the birds gone? So this takes you to our Audubon's Christmas bird count trend viewer. So here we've run some fancy hierarchical models. We use data going back to 1970. We started 1970, even though, of course, we have data going all the way back to 1900. The protocol changed a bit in the 1960s. And also, as I showed, the number of circles and number of participants greatly increased in the 60s through the 70s. And so in order to produce the most reliable results, with the best data, we use 1970 typically as our starting point. though I'm going to show you one analysis we did that went back 90 years. But here we show population trends from 1970 to the most recent results we have up there right now are 2021. And you can also look at shorter intervals if you want to just look at the last 20 years or even just the last 10 years. So we're gonna look at some of these results now. Look at what the CBC tells us. So how are our wintering birds doing? Well, we're able to produce these analyses, these population trend estimates for over 500 species from actually here we're reporting from 1966 to 2021. And of these, 55%, so over half, are showing increasing population trends, 284 species, and 45%, just under half, are showing decreasing population trends. And when we divide this up into different groups, here first we'll look at diet, and we see that hummingbirds and other birds that eat nectar are doing very well. This is the annual percent change population trends. So birds that eat nectar have a population trend that's increasing by over 5% per year. We can also see birds that eat vertebrates. So these are like hawks and herons, egrets, birds like that. They're also doing very well with a increase in their population trends. And then other birds, it's a little bit more of a mixed story. Now looking at bird habitats, birds by habitat they use, the grassland birds, we mentioned earlier, grassland birds are really declining, and you can see this here. They have the strongest population declines of any group, followed by shrubland birds that are also really facing a lot of challenges. And then birds that use a variety of different habitats are actually doing quite well. And also birds that are comfortable using urban areas are thriving. They're doing great with increasing populations. Looking at birds by how far they migrate, long distance migrants are really doing quite poorly. Very, very strong population declines, on average losing 2.5% per year. Whereas resident species and species that have larger ranges that just shrink into smaller ranges for winter, what we call a withdrawal migrant, are also doing well. Okay, so now looking at some of the maps. So these are maps that you see when you go to our Trends Bureau, when you go to that Where Have All the Birds Gone page. And we're going to look at just a few species representing some interesting patterns that we see here. So one is that grassland birds, again, not doing great. They're declining everywhere. So you can see the red here indicates population declines. Gray indicates stability, and then blue, which we're not seeing a lot of here, a little bit there, indicates population increase as population growth. So we're seeing Harris sparrow decreasing almost everywhere, except they're doing okay in Louisiana. Field sparrows are pretty much declining everywhere, especially in Florida. And this again is indicative of this conservation crisis. We had the State of the Birds report came out just a couple months ago, and in that we looked at population trends for the U.S. breeding bird species grouped by their habitat for a similar time period. This is 1970 to 2019. And you can see that grassland birds are in this kind of gold color that have, one of the strongest declines of any group. These tipping point species are the ones that are undergoing the greatest declines. Well, in order to, to help protect grassland birds, take on these challenges that they're facing, National Audubon Society about 6 years ago now developed the Conservation Ranching Program. And the purpose of the Conservation Ranching Program is to stabilize declining grassland bird populations in partnership with land stewards. So right now we have ranches across 15 states. We have 100 ranches that are enrolled in the program, and we have 3 million acres altogether that are in the conservation ranching program. And what does that mean? Well, the program has 3 pillars. The first is habitat management. So ecologists with National Audubon, range ecologists, work with the ranchers, with these private landowners, to together develop a habitat management plan that addresses site-specific habitat goals. So they are, this is a co-developed plan in order to design habitat management that is going to be beneficial for birds, and also at the same time beneficial for carbon sequestration. Another pillar of the program is animal health and welfare. So we're not using feedlots, we're not using antibiotics. It's practices that are best for the animals. And then the third pillar is environmental sustainability. So there's no neonicotinoid pesticides. We're restricting pesticides in general, minimizing fertilizers, doing everything we can to protect the environment overall. So that all sounds nice, but how do we know we're actually impacting birds? Well, this is where I came in, and my colleagues. We developed something called the Bird Friendliness Index, and it is our accountability metric that we use to quantify the impact of the conservation ranching program on grassland and airland birds. And so we take bird count data and we combine it with information about how threatened the birds are. And then we also combine it with information on diversity. And we produce this index that you can see over here that shows how bird friendly an area is compared to other areas, and then also how that changes over time. So we use this at the ranches. And so here are results for the first 6 years of the program, 2016 through 2021, across 95 ranches. And we can see that, first of all, the Bird Friendliness Index, it has a score of 0.58. That's good because 0.5 is average. The values go from 0 to 1. So anything above 0.5 means you're doing better than average. You're doing better than conventionally managed lands for birds. And then also you want to see your Bird Friendliness Index increasing over time, meaning you have more birds, you're supporting more vulnerable birds, and you're supporting more resilient communities. And we are indeed seeing this. It's just 1% per year, but it's an increase, and that compounds. So you're looking at about an 8% increase over time. And we're also seeing increases in diversity of 2% per year. That compounds to over 10% over the 6 years. So the ranchers, when they join this program, they get certified by us because they're implementing their practices. They then get to put this seal here, Audubon certified that the beef was grown on bird-friendly lands, and then this meat, which is fantastic, I can attest for it, is sold through special retailers. It can be sold in restaurants and stores as well, or you can buy it online. So you can go to our website here and find out about places where you can find and buy this bird-friendly beef yourself. Okay, well, back to the CDC data. Oops. Another great story that we can see in the CDC data is how raptors have rebounded from pesticides, from DDT. So DDT, of course, was banned in 1972. And so since 1970, we have just seen widespread increases in bald eagles all across North America, and similarly in ospreys all across North America. I can tell you for both of these, growing up here in Portland, it was incredibly rare to see either. And now, you see them all the time. It's just great to see. And this is thanks to the effort of Rachel Carson in particular, and the many others who fought to get DDT banned. And so you went from, in the 1970s, there being very few bald eagles left in the entire country. Now you can go somewhere like Alaska and see a scene like this with just dozens of bald eagles. Well, now raptors have been a real success story. Shorebirds are another story. We've seen increases for some species in some regions, like black-bellied plovers here doing well in Texas and a little bit in very southern California. American avocets doing well in the Northern California coast, again in Texas, but not doing so great in the southeast. Meanwhile, another big pattern that we're seeing in Christmas bird count data, and that we think is the reason why we're seeing so many increases in general, on average, as I said, on average, 55% of species are increasing, is we're seeing range shifts. Birds are shifting their ranges north in response to climate change. So we see a lot of patterns like this. The hairy woodpecker, you can see the populations are declining in the southeast, but as you go further north, it becomes more blue. Populations really growing strongly in Alaska. And white-crowned sparrow, similar. Populations are declining across the south in the Appalachians, but then are becoming more blue, are increasing more as you go further north. Another group we're really seeing this in are the hummingbirds, where we're seeing these tropical hummingbirds like rufous hummingbird and even buff-bellied hummingbird that are wintering further north with growing populations on the northern edge of their ranges. And we're also seeing this in ducks. I don't know what happened to the other picture, but anyway, we're seeing many duck species shifting north. You can see it especially in American black duck here, with population declines, especially on the Texas coast, increases in Canada. Similarly for ringneck duck. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about other ways CBC data have been used to inform conservation. And again, I want to highlight this duck story. So we've been observing this pattern in the CBC trends for a while. And then we had a professor reach out to us, and he works with hunters a lot in the South. And, hunters have been, noticing for quite a while that they just, they couldn't find ducks anymore. There just weren't weren't as many ducks to go out and hunt. And of course, hunting is very popular activity, especially in the Southeast, and it contributes quite a bit to the economics of many of these, especially rural regions. And so we collaborated with them, Professor Richard Kaminsky at Clemson in South Carolina, and looking at ducks across the eastern U.S., the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways. We saw indeed that species are shifting their ranges north. So you can see it in individual species. We looked at black duck already. Here you can see American widgeon as well, really showing that pattern. Interestingly, redhead is kind of showing the opposite pattern with declines in the north. It's always one that has to be different. But on average, across all the species, we do see this patterns of declines in the south, increases in the north. And when we then say, okay, but is this related to temperature? So we, gathered temperature data and, took the average temperature for each Christmas bird count, and we related it to the abundance trend for that region. We can see a strong negative relationship. So that as temperatures were warming, where temperatures were warmer, we're seeing more negative population trends. We've also looked at winter range shifts a couple other ways. Here, this is showing the change in the mean latitude of the bird center of abundance. So this is across all of North America. This was in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Indicators of Climate Change report. And we're just showing that on average, bird populations have shifted north by over 40 miles since 1966. And a few years ago, I ran this specifically just for California for their own the state EPA's Indicators of Climate Change report, which you can find on their website. And it shows that, again, wintering bird species over 48 years have shifted their range both northward and closer to the coast in California. So we've seen a northward shift of nearly 10 miles and a change over a mile closer to the coast. And then we're like, well, we have all this data. You know, we typically go back to 1970 or sometimes 1966, as I've shown. 1966 is when the breeding bird survey first started. So that's why we often start with that year for comparison. Though in many cases we use 1970 just because there's more data. But anyway, we have all of this data. And so while we can't really use it to tell a lot about bird species, especially that are less common, you know, just because there isn't enough data when you get back before the 1970s, with more common species, or by combining species and looking at combining all data across decadal periods, across 10-year periods, we were able to look at how populations have changed over space and over time over 90 years. So this is what that looks like for mourning doves. So starting out 1920, here red means more birds and blue means fewer. And so we're seeing, you know, birds shifting north over this period. That red expanding north. And then also for sharp-shinned hawks. This one has a more complicated pattern where they kind of shrink their ranges down. They become less abundant across much of the east, and then they expand again and become more abundant. You can see expanding north. So we published a paper on this. It came out in Global Change Biology just last year, I believe. And we showed that using 90 years of Christmas bird count data, that you know, one of the big questions we're always asking is, you know, what are causing declines in bird populations? And the two big drivers are climate and land use change. And it's really hard to tease apart how much of a population change is due to climate and how much of population change is due to land use change, because of course they're both happening at the same time. But with this method, we were able to tease them apart. And we found, very interestingly, that over time, climate is limiting the winter range edges of species. So it's climate warming that is enabling species to move further north. But when you're looking at a space over time, and you want to know, you know, what has caused population trends to change, you know, in that region or to move around, it's land use change that is causing birds, you know, bird populations to change locally through time. And this is especially true for species with constrained habitats. So, you know, in the eastern US, forests are widespread. You know, if you need to move, you can easily move to another patch of forest. Whereas habitats like grasslands and shrublands are quite limited. So it's not as easy for birds to move among them. All right, so let's dig a little bit more into climate change. So a few years ago now, when we were, you know, beginning to look at the predictions, you know, seeing how we're already warming and the predictions for how much global temperature is expected to continue to rise, and knowing the impacts that this has on birds' ranges and how they shift north, we, you know, my colleagues thought, I mean, if you were to, you know, sit down and write a bird guide and, you know, show range maps for 2080, what is that going to look like? And so, you know, this is where the birds occur today. But in 2080, those range maps could really be quite different. And so we developed these models in order to look at how, you know, occurrence is going to change over time, how the species distributions and ranges are going to change. So we had a preliminary report that came out on this back in 2015, and then our updated version, the Survival by Degrees report that came out in 2021, showed that global warming is posing an existential threat to birds. It has been referred to as, quote, the 5th alarm in a 5-alarm fire, and it can be a threat multiplier. So if birds are facing habitat change, perhaps they can deal with habitat degradation, but then you add in climate change, and it's just, the additional stressor can just make it too much. The proverbial straw that broke a camel's back. And our report found that 389 bird species are on the brink, meaning they're expected to lose a substantial proportion of their current range without much gain to replace it. So as an example, here is one species, the wood thrush, occurs across much of the east, has a beautiful song if you've ever been lucky enough to hear it. And this is its range today, but when you project it under a scenario where global climate increases by just 1.5 degrees Celsius, you can see the red refers to range that is going to be lost. So that wood thrush will be losing much of the edges of their range. You won't see them anymore in Florida. And then they're going to be slightly worsening across much of the southeast. Then you see improving along the US-Canadian border, and then gain up into Canada. If instead we have a 3-degree global climate change scenario, global temperature increase, which we're on the way to, then we can see that wood thrush are going to be lost across the majority of the east, with just a small amount of range gain up in Canada. Doesn't make up for all of this range loss. So this is a species that we would consider to be on the brink, losing over half of its suitable range. And there are many species, and support this headline, there's 389 species on the brink, and many of the species that are considered most vulnerable, like greater sage grouse, cerulean warbler, Canada warbler, bobolink, out west mountain plover and piping plover, Sprague's pipit, tricolored blackbird, of course, important for California. These are species that we know are very vulnerable and also are vulnerable to further climate change. And here's a map of what this looks like. So this is the common loon, iconic if you've ever been lucky enough to hear their beautiful song. And we're predicting to lose common loon range across nearly all of the US as the climate continues to warm. So the takeaway is that 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of extinction from climate change. But the good news is that our science also shows that if we take action now, we can help improve the chances for over 3/4 of the species at risk. So by what we mean by that is by limiting climate emissions, that we stay at a 1.5 degree increase instead of a 3. We can help maintain range, help protect over 3/4 of species. Another thing that we've done related to climate change and informing bird conservation is climate strongholds. So these are maps that are showing areas that are very important for groups of birds today, and that also will continue to be very important in the future under these climate change scenarios. So these are areas that are important for forest birds. Here's areas that are important for grassland birds. And here's areas that are important for wetland birds. So these strongholds are then areas that we really want to make an effort to protect and to restore the habitat as needed, because they're going to be really central to preserving bird populations. We also recently have done work looking at natural climate solutions. So, you know, natural habitats, by maintaining and restoring them, by maintaining the carbon that is in the land and restoring them so that they sequester more carbon, this can go a long ways towards helping mitigate climate change. So here, in this map, we're showing areas that by protecting or restoring would benefit both birds by providing, habitat, these climate strongholds, and would also help with carbon mitigation. So the greens are areas that are already holding a lot of carbon and are good for birds. We want to maintain them. And the gold are areas that perhaps are degraded, but could be restored and then would be beneficial for birds as well as for carbon. And we also have another study going on, Climate Watch. It started just a few years ago. And this is a study where we, enlist volunteers such as yourselves to go out and count a handful of species. We started off with the bluebirds and the nuthatches shown here. And what we're doing is going out to areas where birds are seen today, as well as areas where birds are predicted to be in the future. And we're going to continue doing this year after year as a way of validating our models. And then we can use that then to refine our climate models so that we have more accurate predictions and understanding of how climate change is going to affect birds. You also may have heard of 30 by 30, or the America the Beautiful Act that has been going through Congress. And we're also developing science products in order to help support these 30 by 30 planning efforts, identifying areas that are most important to protect and to restore, to protect birds. And recently, we've also been paying a lot of attention to incorporating more human dimensions into our work. We have the motto that where birds thrive, people prosper. And what's good for birds is good for people. And here, this, for example, is a map that is showing areas where there are overlaps between birds, carbon mitigation, as well as disadvantaged communities. And so areas that can help people, provide more natural habitat, provide more outdoor recreation, while also benefiting birds and carbon. So to wrap this all up, in conclusion, what have we learned? What are birds telling us? Well, we're seeing that, according to the Christmas bird count, although over 55% of wintering bird populations increased, 45% are decreasing. A lot of these increases, though, that we're seeing in Christmas bird count, as contrasted to other surveys that are showing more declines, is likely due to these northerly range shifts that we're seeing, although the relative contributions still remain unclear. We expect that future climate change will, produce more frequent and severe weather episodes. And this, just amplifies how important it is for ongoing community science efforts, such as the Christmas bird count, to provide the information. We can continue monitoring population dynamics and understanding how birds are responding to climate and land cover change, so we can then use that information to protect birds. And we also have found that natural climate solutions can benefit birds as well as human communities. So I always like to wrap up with, okay, but what can I do? And there's actually a lot that we can do as individuals. I mean, participating in Christmas bird counts is one, as well as other monitoring programs and programs such as Climate Watch. You can volunteer for various programs, monitoring, stewardship, and restoration. Also, we have a big effort to native plants for birds, you can go to our website and put in your location, and it will produce lists of native plants that grow well in your region and that are good for birds. And finally, you can be a voice for birds. And hashtag birds tell us is the hashtag we use on social media. And there are also lists of actions, 7 simple actions you can take to help birds, including drinking shade-grown coffee, reducing plastic use, doing citizen or what we call community science, making your windows safer. As you may know, windows can be a source of collisions for many birds. Keeping your cats indoors, using native plants, and avoiding pesticides. And also, this is taken from our website. You can Google it and find ways to make your home more bird friendly. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining me tonight, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you have.
Thank you, Nicole. That was wonderful. It's good to get the update on what's happening with the Christmas bird count. And thank you all for attending this evening. We're going to follow up with a Q&A session in a moment for those who want to stay. But before you leave, please stay engaged with the Land Trust by following our various social media accounts or visiting our website. You can view past presentations and download educational materials on our Nature at Home page on our website, and I'm putting that link in the chat. You can keep an eye out for our monthly Language of the Land webinars. We always have some great speakers lined up, and I'll put that link in the chat too. And tonight we focused on birding, and I wanted to mention that our Sonoma Land Trust community of birders are also dedicated donors who provide vital support because they recognize the importance of our conservation impact. Sonoma Land Trust is a nonprofit organization, which means we rely on donations from individuals, businesses, and foundations to make our work possible. If you like what you heard today, please consider donating. Your gift helps support land protection and preservation, which is where the habitat that these birds need to thrive, and be resilient to climate change, which we know is impacting these bird species, as Nicole mentioned. To make a donation online to Sonoma Land Trust, visit sonomalandtrust.org and click the donate button. And thank you so much. In these uncertain times, we appreciate everyone who is supporting our work. So questions. I had a question, Nicole, about with the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, were there less participants? Like, do you feel like that had an impact on the trends or the data analyzing it in the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Definitely, we had a huge drop in the number of participants. We had to change the protocols. The CBC historically has been just a big social event. We often, some of the bigger counts will have large dinners at the end of the night to come up with the total counts, and of course that was not happening. But we don't expect that, and we have not seen that has impacted the trends, because when we're calculating the trends, we calculate calculate instead of just the raw number of birds seen, it's the birds per party hour, as I showed on that one slide. So, if you see 10 birds and there were 10 hours, or 100 birds and there were 100 hours, it's the same.
Thanks. And then questions can be submitted again via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then I will read the questions to Nicole. And then so you published that paper last year, and then what are you currently working on that's using the CBC data? Well,
we just produced the new trends. And so the trend viewer that I shared that's online with the Where Have All the Birds Gone link is going to be updated to 2022. We also, I should have put in there and I forgot, we're developing some new trend products. So one of the issues people will say, especially managers, is, okay, that's great. We know how birds are doing across these very large areas, across states, or these bird conservation regions. But I want to know how birds are doing in my local region, in my town. And so we have produced what we call spatial CBCs, where the trends are summarized at much smaller spatial scales. and it shows some really neat patterns. So yeah, we're using CBC for that, and then also, involved in some larger initiatives, like, for example, Canada. The Canadian government relies on CBC data quite a bit in order to develop their version of an endangered species list and monitor how their most threatened birds are doing, because many of, especially the shorebirds and the waterfowl that breed in the far north of Canada, are not very well monitored on the breeding grounds, and so they rely on these wintering counts.
Great, thanks. So first question here, given urban birds doing well and given that house finches are prone to diseases, are house finches in North America still considered prospering?
Great question. It's really up and down with house finches. They're urban birds. They don't mind people too much. So in that way, they're doing well. But then they do get these periodic outbreaks of salmonella and other diseases that lead to population crashes. So they're kind of all over the board.
How can we make buildings more and develop land more hospitable to birds in range?
Great question. There are a lot of ways. So there are ways that you can, by using less glass in the first place, or using glass in areas where it's just not reflecting back the natural environment as well. And then there are different types of glass, and there are stickers and other appliques that you can use to put on your glass in order to reduce the reflectivity. You can also use like strings or something that hang just behind the glass. If you Google bird-friendly buildings, we have a large initiative that that advocates for using a lot of these building materials that can really reduce bird collisions.
I'm curious why most of the data presented is from the East and Western species are omitted.
I did show a couple studies that focused on the East. For those, the one especially that focused on the East was the one that went back 90 years. And just because the East has been more populated for longer, and because that is where Christmas bird counts really took off, we had enough data to go back 90 years in the East. In the West, there were just too few circles in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so because we wanted that historical extension, we decided to focus on the East. But when you're looking at the trends and you're looking at all of our other products, it's across North America.
And I know you touched on this in your what you can do to help birds slide, but what impact do domestic cats have on declining populations?
Oh, huge. I mean, cats are the #1 killer of birds. It's less clear the actual population impacts, but cats are killing, I want to say the number is like 2 billion birds a year just in the United States. I mean, it's huge. And so this is why many Audubon societies, like my local Portland Audubon, have programs like Cat Safe at Home. We have catio tours here. You can go and go to different people's houses and see the creative catios that they build, and keeps your cats safe from coyotes and roads too.
Why are there no bird counts in Europe, Asia, Africa, etc.?
So there are other organizations like Audubon that run their own bird counts. They have their own versions. So there are bird counts. They're just not Audubon counts.
They're just not branded Christmas bird counts.
Yes.
I wonder if local bird surveys will take into account the rapid shrubland loss due to wildfire mitigation measures, eliminating all the understory. For example, at Spring Lake, the understory is almost completely gone. What does that mean for quail, towhee, ruby-crowned kinglet, etc., and therefore how that affects the predators, hawk, owl, etc., who rely on those species as prey?
Yeah, that sounds like a PhD dissertation for somebody to do. We don't have that kind of information in the CBC. yeah, we're not gathering information. I mean, you can relate it after the fact. So that's something where, you know, somebody, it could be us or it could be anybody because the data are freely available, could look at, you know, relationships between abundance or trend and wildfire and wildfire mitigation. That would be a great study.
Does the CBC count birds at night?
Some people do. So you have your real diehards. You know, most people just go out during the day. As I said, CBC is a very social activity. But you have your diehards who they're out there at midnight and they're counting owls and they're keeping going until midnight the next night.
Have you been able to look at the impact of wetland restorations on bird populations? Is it possible to drill down in the CBC data to look at particular restored areas?
We have done that. I don't know if it's been done with CBC, but as a matter of fact, we have a couple of papers from the Great Lakes looking at impacts of wetland restoration on birds. It was just it used breeding data rather than wintering data, especially with marsh birds because they're so secretive. They're harder to count in the winter. In the breeding season, because they're vocalizing more, you get better counts. And so we typically use breeding season data for those analyses.
Is the data being collected from eBird being used by Audubon? How does eBird dovetail with CBC counts?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of the opposite. People will often enter their CBC data into eBird. It does not all go in there. Like we have our own database. But I know that many people who do a CBC count who are eBirders will put the data there as well.
Okay, those are all the questions from the audience, and I'm going to end with asking you what your spark bird is. What is the bird that got you into conservation, into ornithology, and passionate about birding?
Yeah, there's a couple, but I think the one that really got me most excited was when I was growing up, my grandfather was a birder, and he particularly loved tree swallows. He had nest boxes in his backyard that he put up for the tree swallows. And I remember him telling me the story of how the tree swallows show up at the Mission of San Juan Capistrano every year at the same time. And I just thought that was so miraculous that happens and that people know it, and how cool are birds. And so I've been hooked ever since.
Great. Well, thank you again, Nicole. It was fascinating, informative, and wonderful as always. And thank you to Mariana for interpreting, and thank you all for attending. And have a great holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you next year at another Language of the Land webinar.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ariana.